Hello everyone, today we talk about Hunnic and Gothic warfare for our Eurasian Steppes warfare series. Just a brief introduction about these people's warfare and their interaction, right? Their mutual influence, right? One, of course, had on the rest of Eurasia by a different degree, naturally. We could start from simply this greater sense of a turning point in history, right? Eurasian civilization at large, right? We will see it better in the videos about China, but essentially the history of, say, the Roman Empire, the Chinese one, are roughly comparable as basically the two major sedentary civilizations and largest empires in the world at the time. Largest also properly in terms of amount of people inhabiting there, and general level of development of civilization, of technological achievement, and so on, right? And this period historically is a moment of great crisis or great contraction, right? As we've explained countless times, the migration era was not really a party for everyone involved, right? Not even the, say, migrating peoples, whether they were nomads or semi-nomads, that is, at some point, if you look at the Germans, also peoples that had been sedentary, fundamentally, up to the era prior, and that put themselves, again, in motion. There is nothing simply positive or exploitative or successful about them. These were very risky enterprises that were often triggered by conditions of reasons of major force, let's put it in this way, and mostly as it's been perhaps overly stressed, like at least triggered by some domino effect connected with these people's movements. Today I will not digress on, say, the various historiographical interpretation, something like this period broadly meant as late antiquity, as the migration era, whichever you want to use as a term to describe them, because naturally these changes were triggered by moral dynamics that are not immediately traceable from a documentary historiographical point of view, and even less from a material one, but that can be, say, dimensioned at least through them, considering that they were likely the most important here. The moment of crisis is mostly explained as essentially a softening of the, say, of whoever had a success prior to this era, right? The idea is that like the Roman Empire, this great civilization, had become so rich and prosperous, etc. Then it had softened up. It had gentrified. It had been spoiled, right, and fundamentally had weakened itself, right? This is a dynamic that objectively does happen. Historically, it happened at the time, it's happening today, and as we know, all these eras are eventually, let's say, the collapse, really, of a system that drags everyone down, including the people who are sabotaging it, sometimes self-sabotaging it, because this is also very often what the concept really is, but that generally speaking correspond also to a specific consumption of resources, or overexploitation, or at least poor distribution, or lack, say, if not in the capacity of using it, at least in the willingness to think that the effort is worth it, right? And so that entails giving up the initiative, other people taking these resources over, brings to the collapse of the system by a degree that starts consuming everybody's resources involved, because those resources that have been momentarily given up on by the most developed are unitly the scraps, right, most of the times, of of their assets, and those who settle there have now the problem of handling them in a way that have never quite done before, and always with a condition of attrition, of competition, of conflict, indeed also of hybrid, right? Especially warfare causes that dramatically, right? It can be the greatest destroyer of civilization as much as the greatest synthesis of the same, and which is exactly what happens in this period. But one shouldn't think, in fact, that this gradual softening, weakening, contraction was just, again, a matter of those who were from one side or the other. As a matter of fact, the same steppes witness this mechanism, right? And this is often, let's say, again, I would like to digress, telling the truth about certain specific topics, how, for example, nationalism has interpreted in the 19th century this phase as if there was a liberation or an improvement, or it was, again, a massive disaster for everybody involved. And even worse than that, like when you look at the peoples that were inhabiting the steppes, right, you realize that things went actually much worse for them, right? As they weren't a unitary people, a unitary ethnicity, a unitary culture, and they were actually overrun by other barbarians. They were barbarians within the same steppes, right? In particular, the Indo-Europeans, the Iranians, basically lose the hegemony over the steppes, right? As they're overrun by essentially Turkic elements that will dominate for another half of a millennium before the Mongols came about. Naturally, these systems are not, as we just said, like mutually, like, it was not a genocide of everyone that belonged to a certain linguistic or ethnic group on the scale of, say, Indo-Europeans or Turco-Mongols and so on. There were entire peoples that were literally wiped out, though, in the process. There is a blend of these peoples, but you cannot make moral relativism about the fact that, yes, essentially Turkic elements, even elements coming from further away, from even Proto-Mongolians, Eastern Asia, we know it's mostly from the elites, these people, began to rule over other peoples, right? Very often, again, it's very easy to make moral relativism on the basis of saying, but we don't know, they were mixed, they were a group that, and usually that is often made to say, at the end of the day, we finally freed ourselves of, the terrible Rome, or the terrible China, or whatever, and this is not just historically, this is not just bad, methodologically speaking, also because it literally, this wasn't literally the point. All these steps were basically infringed itself in a rather miserable way against sanitary civilizations. These were the ones that were sitting on a pile of resources that mostly contracted, dried up, became more scarce, but still remained civilization till to this very day, and that kept living that way, that basically absorbed and culturally, hegemonized even the elites that at some point mixed with their own from these other worlds. What happened in the steppes wasn't any of this, right? In part, there was, as we've seen, a blend, but the idea that, there were some groups dominating in steppes, at some point, these new tides arrive and crush entire systems that had been lasting for 4 centuries or more at this point, and cause a mess, because they literally increase the entropy of this all, right? More resources are spent, and in the steppes, again, it's not like in the sanitary world. Again, the sanitary world lives on. The steppes are already dramatically lacking resources, and this thing destroys an enormous amount of them, causing, again, this total disaster, increasing and explaining, in that sense, fairly well what was happening in the haste, in the impact, in the violence, in the ruthlessness of these migrations. So that, yes, these peoples were really the scourge of God, as much as they were literally uncivilized and incapable of handling civilization. That's how, after all, overrated the Huns, for example, really are, right? They the Germans could settle in the Romanized lands because, after all, they had been Romanized themselves from half of a millennium, and they knew how the system worked, and they were easily assimilated, and they, again, lived together with essentially the same majority of Roman population that developed, the most powerful entities in medieval times. The steppes and those areas that had remained also non-nomadic areas, let's say, that had remained in the Barbaricum, such as great parts of Central and Eastern Europe, instead lived some of that were further damaged historically to a degree that you can still properly sense the structural scale of until this very day. Right, there is a reason why Eastern Europe is more backwards and less productive and less, generally speaking, work. Waves of, say, millennia of waves of nomadic peoples, right, always contending the frontier with these savages that were coming essentially to rape, slaughter, and deport, and nothing else. Because also the Romans enslaved, deported, and massacred, but at least they built a civilization in the process. These peoples really didn't do much of any of that, right? And as we have seen, they were really the ones drawing. We've seen it in panoply, in warfare, etc. The best of what the same sedentary civilizations could produce. And again, the mere fact that they were in the steppes was the demonstration that they couldn't live anywhere else, right? While they always tried to get somewhere better, and when succeeding, at least doing it either as subject peoples or immediately diluting among the sedentaries. I mean, think about, we will see it now in other videos about the Bulgars, the Avars, the Magyars, etc. Their destiny in the sedentary world was obviously sedentary, right? The steppes element could not quite survive, if not in actual steppe areas like the Pannonian, say the Hungarian plain. But again, in surrounding areas that were, generally speaking, more backwards, less productive, more sparsely populated, worse connected, and so on, right? So this turning point in history is a drama for many reasons that include also the ecumenic nature of the empire. So the we could say the ambition, right, of the Catholic Empire ruling all over the world from this time onwards historically is never achieved. It was never reachieved again, right? This civilization was aware up to 200 years ago, basically, that the only thing that had mattered historically had been the capacity of powers like the Roman one from the western side and the eastern one, the China from the eastern one, to achieve something that no other people had ever done historically. And this thing was hopelessly destroyed, right? It was fragmented, right? No other power ever rose to the same level of relative capacity, force, prosperity, advancement. And the moral impact, again, was magnitudinal, to say the least, right? So imagine 4 millennia of civilization that are radically impacted by these waves that you shouldn't really be thanking if, at least you didn't include into the equation the fact that also the sedentaries had weakened to the point that they were responsible for it as well, right? But changing for the better are two very different things. So the Great Migrations definitely do have this impact, right? When you look at warfare, you really can't measure the clash, right? The impact, the crash, right? And this is, by the way, not taking away anything from the fact, the capacities of, say, the early medieval Turkic horsemen, as we will see now. That, as I often say, like one of my favorite phrases is never make the childish mistake to think to be more intelligent or more capable than a 7th century Bulgar horseman, right? Which I think is one of, those safe grounds in which you can start grafting an entire worldview, because you cannot be, at this point in history, at least you could, but empirically, right, people have lost that capacity, right? The same goes for even these previous peoples, the Huns. And what also the Germans had learned, especially in these eastern spaces, in Ukraine, in Crimea, in areas that we have already appreciated from the previous videos, for, say, being this sort of frontier between the civilized world, the steppe, right, and we will see at the end of the video how the gods, in fact, stepped in, and what they were able to accomplish accordingly. Again, I have videos about the Huns. By the way, today I'm not going to discuss the Hunnic, let's say, origin, if not approximately, but I made videos on that, and we'll make others. There is a playlist on gods, right, at different times of their history, in their settlement, their migration. We'll have to come back on that at some point, right? So, but we start with the Huns, who essentially are considered the responsible for the great movement, at least as far as the nomadic one, and that, again, was just, you don't have to think as the, say, one day a Hun wakes up and say, okay, let's make an empire, let's push everybody west or east, depending on where we have to hit, and let's do this. And everybody, oh yeah, I never thought of that. No, of course there is a major radical moral intertwinement between Rome, China, the steppes, and these peoples were literally testing that kind of imperial vitality to be able to get ready to exploit at the fullest all the opportunities arising, right? Talking about Central Asia in general, because as I was just saying, the Hunnic origins, as you know, are somewhat debated. The main problem deriving from the fact that we do not have exactly the, say, that ring of the chain of ethnic, ethnographic, we could say, connections, to tell us, look, the Huns at some point were this other people, for example, that we had known in these other sources. Most people go for the Xiongnu, right? Some see the connection with the Yuezhi that were surely also connected with the Iranians as well. There is no doubt that all these peoples were connected in a way. If anything, because every time one destroyed another, normally the latter became a subject of the former, right? And so, of course, these peoples were mixed dramatically. But what matters still, and especially in the steppes, to an important degree for these movements specifically, is the hierarchy, right? So what we see among the Huns is definitely a Proto-Turkic component, even with elements going as far as, probably Eastern Asia, even among Mongol elements and beyond, right? And so nomadic peoples that we cannot better identify. Some, again, stress the Xiongnu connection. Is it so important after all? Right? In practice, it's really not, because most of what we know about the Huns, at least from the western side, and in fact, we miss exactly that connection with the Chinese sources by a degree, but we will get a bit more in depth in another video, because that's really, at least one has to go by the evidence, not just talking broadly. Begins late, right? We start seeing this people pushing westwards. It took centuries, right? It wasn't that immediate, right? And so obviously in that time there were lots of Iranian elements that were surely co-opted by these peoples, also in the elites, right? However, the dominant group, and in the steppes again, the the concept of who was above, who was below, was very, very markedly stressed, right? Makes us see that the groups that were at the top were quite different from the ones that had dominated, especially Western Eurasia and also a great part of Central Asia in the Indo-European background. And I have reasons to suspect this, also on the basis of some military and moral characteristics that we will explain now. Right? There is, for example, no doubt that the Iranian horsemen had been dominating these spaces for a long time now, sharing, as you know, solar Iranian Apollonian cult based on the properly on the veneration of the heavenly rule, right, of with a projection towards the stars, heaven, etc. That, however, had not, let's say, probably changed in relative terms that differently from, say, the times, say, from how it had happened in the Roman Empire, for example. Right, the idea that we've seen in the previous chapters, also the Iranian steppe at a point began to settle down, right, moving towards a more sedentary destination. Let's say the affirmation of a heavier panoply connected with naturally a sort of feudal elite, right? It evidently was capable of supplying all these forces on the battlefield for the base of some change from the original steppe brutality. It's not quite different from the idea of the Romans that emerged from this kind of continental tribal warlike mentality and eventually become this great sort of Pelasgian civilization with masses controlled by, let's say, an elite that has accumulated too much wealth and cannot control the bases much and is sclerotizing, right? So as I was saying before, we would probably be surprised by the degree, right? This an entire world, an entire era, right here would be enormously important religious considerations to make, because these peoples did realize what the accomplishment of ecumenic empires really were, right? This meant having transfigured the world. The steppes gravitated around the cemeteries. They weren't like we would be influenced to think nowadays in terms, we are the steppes, we have a radically different identity, we're not part of mankind, whatever happens from those damned cemeteries is nothing, we are the best and we are all different. There was no kind of mentality like that, right? Everybody was extremely fearful and impressed and aware of the accomplishments of, say, emperors, as we've seen in the same sagas had found out at Gaugamela on the Yaxartes, of Alexander the Great, right, or of the Roman Empire, as far as the Sarmatians especially began to push against its frontiers. The same gods, right, what we have described, even in the presence of some kind of darker chthonic forces, is the degree by which the peoples who lived at the outskirts of civilization had not accomplished yet a great power accordingly, felt themselves to be the undertakers, right? The ones that were still to rise and therefore were more connected to, say, necrophagus symbology, the crow as opposed to the eagle, the wolf, all these kind of Gefolgschaft symbols rather than properly the one of leadership. This had been true for the Romans as well, right? Also, after their rise, the Romans standardized the eagle as their symbol, which was not the case prior, right? So this language was extremely shared in such dynamics exactly because they all cared about properly, giving themselves a face that, identifying themselves in the correct level of divine advancement that their culture had been able to accomplish and to achieve, right? Naturally, they were all very warlike, right? And especially, again, the peoples of the outskirts of civilizations had to be warlike, because if they hadn't been, they would have been taken over by their neighbors in the first place. But they literally didn't have enough resources to centralize further. They necessarily had to raid. They had to be these kind of pain in the behind, naturally, for everybody involved. But eventually settling down and civilizing. Right? The Germans gave great proof of this, after all, during the migration era, and together with the Romans again. So the difference, right, between this world and the proper nomads is very solid, and in a sense there was such let's say, dichotomy. Of course, at some point would have been inverted. We know mostly the story of the cemeteries, for which these hordes from the heart of the steppes, coming from God knows where, were just essentially some monsters, divine punishment, some kind of something like beasts crawling out of the bowels of the earth, of the underworld, of hell itself, to come to, in fact, threaten the higher heavenly civilization, right? Think about the Civitate Dei by St. Augustine. That was just, say, something more, in fact, less secular in principle, but that was referring naturally to the times of the invasions and so on. Naturally, the nomads would have thought highly of their own individual accomplishments if they especially managed to create empires of this scale. Also, the one of the Huns, at least temporarily, managed to maintain. As we will see, there were the black Huns in Europe. The white ones were the Ephthalites in Central Asia, lasting also a bit longer and harassing mostly the Sasanians and Indians, so on. In any case, so the Uranian Chthonic values are always dichotomic. They always coexist with one another, right? Just one has to understand which side takes over or which not. The point having been the Huns, the last of these peoples, right? This is, again, yet another recurring theme. The idea that civilization spends itself at waves, right? And that the people from kind of the more primitive corners at some point spring out, right, as it would happen with the Mongols finally, right, with the last cycle of steppes history, to say again collect for a more primitively brutal background the legacy of the other steppes rulers, and hitting at these civilizations were more or less clumsily rebuilding from the ashes, right? And that, however, had not grown less resistant, actually, against these nomadic elements, right? So, in scoring surely some glory, the Huns, as we've seen, were Proto-Turkic nomads, largely. Right, who in former times had already crushed the Kushans and the Saka, right? So those peoples that had actually dominated the steppes from the probably the peak of of warlike, let's say, horsemanship, that had developed cataphract, functionalized combined armed tactics on horseback between the shock and the missile element, right? So a bit the equivalent of the Romans or the Huns in the steppes, right? And that had gradually started declining. Likely the Huns, even if they had not been the Xiongnu precisely, would have surely been akin to them, would have been in that world, would have participated to the invasions also of China, right? And they would have kept on fighting against even other peoples. We've seen it in part in the video about Tibetan warfare, so how many elements were really swarming around there. For us also, not to be extremely informed about. At least, China, yes, does give us some insightful information about them ethnographically, etc. But especially that northeastern Asian corner is not entirely visible, right, in our radar to the point of distinguishing against this groups quite neatly. In any case, it was a meat grinder, right? These peoples, at least at some point, these Turkic elements were routed in Mongolia by the same Proto-Mongols, the Xianbi, and moved west, right? So, however it happened, whether it was these people or the Chinese or whatever, what we see is that these elements move west, which may have happened simply also because other peoples were given ground to them, or seemed, mature to be collected as, in fact, as fruits of conquest. And these bearers of a well-developed nomadic culture, at this point, had already been enriched, in fact, by the Chinese influence, mixed definitely with the local Iranian-speaking cattle breeders in Central Asia and in the Tian-Shan region, the latter basically the homeland of the Alani, so the single most successful steppe people, right, to ever, say, at least in terms of individual quality, to have ever ridden across Eurasia. So this tells, we've seen it in the video about Kushan and Tocharian warfare as well, that fundamentally, yes, there was a sort of Turkic lordship over some of the cradle properly of Aryan culture up to this moment of decline, and that contributed to push such avalanche of leaders and subjects towards the 3rd and 4th century westwards. Right, their military was definitely impressive by this point. Right, they could boast a magnificent set of weapons, mostly based on Central Asian tradition of the early 1st millennium AD. So mostly again Iranian in technique, but also deriving from the Senatory empires, consisting of a long cavalry spear with a pendant or a bell attached to the shaft that had all a mystical meaning, essentially producing a divine sound according properly to the movement of this life, of the heavenly horses, of the same divine rulers riding them, and so on. It's a bit like the later Tug, just to make an example. So the direction they would follow according to the wind, to heaven, to the still celestial, again, religion that pertained just to the conquerors. And that, especially in the spear element, naturally inherited that shock, anti-armor, anti-cavalryman capacity that the Saka had and the Kushans had proficiently developed prior, right, together with heavily armored horsemen and mounts as well. What starts happening here is what gives me to think that the shift happened still, however, through a sort of qualitative crack, right, of the celestial bolt. Why? Because of one aspect which is apologically very interesting and that you're probably aware of if you're interested in steppe warfare, that is to say, the beginning of, say, the spread of single-edged swords and daggers that fundamentally would take over the straight ones during the Turkic phase of the Eurasian steppes. Right? One would think, but why was this happening? Well, it's very difficult to explain because we're talking about a vast amount of territories and equally of time, but that likely have to do, at least in my opinion, with a lower collective, at least a lower value of the larger amount of horsemen, right? The subjects, the lightly armored ones, compared to the Iranian era, right? Why do I think so? Well, first of all, because single-edged swords are actually easier to handle, right? They require less training. They're somehow more there are different varieties, of course. There are massive at some point, and this was stemming from the same Huns. In fact, two-handed, right? Even still at this point, also double-edged swords, right? So things that even when they're single-edged, were still massive beasts that we've seen also in Mongol warfare that had nothing, let's say, to particularly envy to some of the finest straight ones of the Iranians, of the later Western knights that basically were the heirs of. But still, with the idea that the average horseman is mostly like somebody that simply doesn't indulge much into that sense of individual heroic warfare, where you mostly go for the direct hit, even at close range, in the armor joints, in a context again where things are getting slowly more. It's a big word for the steppes, but say sedentary, more feudal in nature, and more in the sense equally distributed. This is a bit the same concept of the Roman Empire, right? The idea that at the beginning they were all freemen with civic rights, and including the one of bearing arms and being more politically cohesive, and then by late antiquity, having grown in this, again, elite that owned all the land, all the latifundia, all the people essentially working on them, demilitarized and somehow already superstitiously subjected to a sclerotized hierarchy. In this sense, what happens in this great turmoil in the steppe seems to have dramatically impoverished the average person inhabiting there. So that aside from nomadism or non-nomadism, the average subject would be more cheaply equipped, more impoverished, again, more desperate, more, let's say, even just eager to start resuming nomadism on a much longer range. I mean, the Huns seem to have been exactly the product of this, because they were hungrier, less trained, less individually capable, but still, together, of course, valuable, to fight essentially and mostly as archers, right? And just with close range being more cutting than thrusting, right? So in a place where even material culture was getting poorer, there was less armor around, and this seems to have been the Turkic phase, and also the Mongolian one later. There are things changing, but again, the idea that order of the Iranians that had been creating all these various lordships across Western and Central Eurasia gradually also began to gentrify to the point of being taken over, right, by these new waves. And this exemplifies, again, the level of general desperation that was happening in the steppes. And so all this dramatic stories about, again, people pushing another or destroying another one, of course, starting to lord over the subjects, in a general ferocity, right? If you look even from the Chinese had always been more directly exposed to the nomads in a sense. The Romans not so much, right? After all, the early empire had been really calm, right? There was no people de facto threatening Rome. They were all weaker, poorer powers that didn't hadn't even developed properly much of a political cohesion, a punching force. At this point, the steppes start, say, pressuring other peoples, such as the Germans, even to form into confederacies, even drawing from, for example, the Roman equipment, as we will see now. So to increase their level of combativeness, at least in temporal political cohesion, to take advantage of this great giant that was beginning to give way in some parts, right? Again, none of these peoples, say the only peoples that managed to settle in the empire are people that had already been sedentaries and living fundamentally within the empire, right? Doesn't matter whether, as you know, the Romans didn't really have borders, right? The legions on the Rhine or the Danube weren't just to keep peoples out. They were to control the people who were from one side and the other, and basically succeeding so for centuries, right? So those were to be assimilated. We're talking about the Germans, we're talking about the Slavs, but by some degree even other peoples, surely also the Iranian ones of the Pontic steppes that had gradually, as we've seen, sedentarized. The Huns wouldn't, right? Part of these peoples would naturally sedentarize, but essentially losing their own ethnic identity, because that was founded on the steppe system, and mostly on this kind of herdsman function that they had, and that was the only reason, arguably, why they had gained temporarily some upper hand on, at least on the frontier, right? The Huns basically melt away, right? And all the other peoples that had been subjected to them are freed from it, and they keep, again, interacting as sedentaries, as they had been doing before, right? But the Huns evaporate, right? And surely they had co-opted part of these peoples, but they were still steppes conquerors, and especially nobody liked them. The Germans, the Iranians were all fleeing, putting even more pressure in this sense on the Roman frontier. I mean, the greater example here are really the Goths, right? We will not be talking about the two branches, but famously enough, those who would have been known as the Visigoths and would fight from the side of the Romans against the same Huns within the empire, and the ones called the Ostrogoths later would have fought with the Huns against the empire. But they were really just essentially victims of the circumstances, right? They were still leaving, as we've seen, the Visigoths being essentially used to be thrown against one another between the eastern and western Roman halves. The Goths basically being wiped out, right? Having created a Bosporan kingdom that had reached a great level of success, even taking over the Iranians there, and that was wiped out by the Huns. And so what you see, what the Ostrogoths really are after the end of the Hunnic Empire, is a much wider coalition of many other peoples also that is just grouping and moving without much of a territorial rooting anymore. So this is also for all the people who say, "Oh no, they're actually, the Huns." Or you see also articles, they were actual Germans, yeah, with lederhosen and this is the mental damage that has been caused by radical underschooling, even in the most educated countries in the world. I mean, the complete failure of school, family, parents especially. We cannot trust people anymore. We cannot, give them more than a certain amount of responsibility, because they literally do not have any idea anymore what history has been. And again, the conflictual sense, the desperation, the sense of instability, of crisis, right, was incumbent among all the peoples that found themselves in this blender, fundamentally. So, I was talking about the Hunnic equipment. Well, we've talked about swords and daggers. This would be strapped to the right hip or slung from the belt at the front, right? another element that reveals the more chthonic prevalence among the Huns, so a bit like the rebels of the Apollonian order established by the Indo-Europeans, coming from literally the bowels of the earth as bloodthirsty demons, right, was the prevalence, not on the historical, again, this magnificent, as we've seen, a massive Indo-European swords that were typical, also the Sarmatian mounds eventually being injected in the West. Again, think about Excalibur, the sword in the stone, likely stemming from, again, the Sarmatian culture, the Roman auxiliaries that were left stationed in Britain, and that we find, generally speaking, this spirit of knighthood was revived in Europe, especially by the Alani, but it's other elements that established many of some groups that today we consider, for example, as Slavic, but were originally vehiculated, commanded, led by this strong nuclei of, at that point, broken, say, the remains of broken peoples, but that individually were pretty darn good in terms of the most traumatically and ruthlessly developed knightly culture existing in the steppes. So the Huns were coming here as swarms of locusts equipped with this massive bow, right? This was the main Hunnic weapon, this massive bow with bone and horny reinforcing facing plates. Essentially, even this, an Iranian invention, as we've seen that, or at least the weapon had been developed the most to the fullest functionality by the Iranians, is the composite bow, increased in power further, right? So relying, as we've seen, even more, not much on the hand-to-hand combat and the clash and this kind of direct physicality. Of course, the Huns would be, as all of all these warriors practicing wrestling, it's full of those traditions since, always, all over Eurasia, different types of sports, also fighting with the club and so on, but mostly increasing their own missile force, right? So this is by itself, from a strictly strategical point of view, a step backwards, right? You don't smash with direct hit, but basically skirmish. Doesn't matter from how long, with which penetrating power, with which, again, increased range, in fact, useful range. Compared to the previous time, missile warfare, by definition, is light. Right? At this point in history, before essentially the second half of the 17th, the half of the 17th century, the missile element is, by definition, inferior to the shock one. Right, so loading on this at this point is a declaration of military involvement. But what matters here is, again, these masses, this primitive ruthlessness, even as we have seen a simpler, cheaper way of training, of putting in the field, these people were angry and hungry. They were resentful for all the kind of the marginalization they had in the steppes by the side of this other great conquerors of Central Asia. Were now coming, right, exploiting their weakness to settle the matter, right? So as I was saying before, generally speaking, the Huns, at least for what Western civilization has tried to make it, this terrible, devastating enemy that threatened destroyed civilization, well, they are overrated, right? Naturally, the Huns never had the capacity of doing that. At best, they actually wanted the Roman Empire to survive because it was much tidier to force them into some tribe locally than just carrying out a dangerous expedition, such as the one in Gaul in 450, where they were defeated by the Romans and the Germans at the Catalonian plains, showing even there the superiority of sedentary civilization. the Hunnic Empire disgregated soon after the death of Attila. There were some continuities, but mostly at that point were even maintained as a sort of useful lordship by some peoples that, especially the Longobards, seemingly stayed the longest, even under Attila's son, as a protector, things like that, and that in fact did leave a kind of a technical, zootechnical, especially capacity among these populations that again were Germans, and they actually remained mostly Germans, even ethnically speaking, right? The sense that during the migration era everything was blended. These peoples were all, we cannot talk about them as Germans. They were also Sarmatian or Turks. Yes, there were these elements, but you know the outlook of these peoples, first of all, remained fundamentally, even just to look in the proportion of cavalry and infantry, sedentary, Germanic, right? At best semi-nomadic. Yes, the arms and armor were dramatically similar to the one of the steppes, but there is no evidence to claim that, I don't know, we can't call them Germans because, you know, the word Sarmas or Germanic, right? This is just a bit of a bias that has struck. Because when you actually look at the movement of these people, so you realize that, yes, they absorbed these waves of fragmented elements, whatever, but aside from the capacity of essentially integrating them in the ethnic core, and thus also the fact of Germanizing them in the long run, the question is, again, do we have any evidence of how many there were there? And do we have any indicators for saying that? And the easy answer is no, right? We don't have the evidence, especially in the sedentary world, that one people simply, you know, took an entire chunk of another. This happened mostly just in the nomadic world, right? And this is particularly important to stress, as it was proven also by the emergence of certain, in fact, Germanic peoples with the same name after the same Hunnic domination, whereas in the steppes, when you were destroyed, right? You could reemerge as a survivor, but you would change name, you would connect with others. So there are two very different spaces that should not be mixed. And I can't stress enough how different they really are. Right? So increased missile fire that can overwhelm it with numbers, with masses, but it's not much of an improvement compared to the immediately previous period. Again, this is not even to say that overall, again, the sagas, the Sarmatians had been better, right? Evidently, there was something wrong with them, right? We're comparing them from the top of their power. They had also sunk for being overwhelmed by these populations. And again, it's not about technology; it's about moral forces, right? Now, the Hunnic bow was kept in a goritos, either strung or unstrung. All these horsemen knew perfectly well how to keep their bowstrings dry, even in very humid weather. Sometimes they had a really lifelong, let's say, experience on horseback, right, as warriors or as raiders, and they could simply just at a glance, looking at, understanding from a certain terrain, from the weather, from whatever, what kind of place it was useful for the cattle, if they could saddle, how long they could stay, how much it took for the horses to graze, and so on. So that's all a magnitudinally expansive system that is basically far beyond anything that most people today working in the tertiary have any capacity of formulating in their brains. And the point is that if you screw up in the steps, you die, right? You don't get maybe just a little less pay or fired, even in a disgustingly opulent world where people basically are complaining only because they do not want to work, because that's at the end of the day what all the crisis is really about, and are not willing to work their asses off like just their parents or grandparents would do without blinking. Well, here it's a bit the same concept, right? Except the standards were escalatorily higher than anything we have today for everybody involved, right? Even for the Roman colonist, for the Germanic tribesmen, etc. So the Hunnic defensive arms were also very rich, which seems to reinforce the idea that, as we will see now, coupled with the general lifestyles of these people, the fact that they wouldn't establish much of a longer or stable or clearly outlined dominion, is that they were so because they looted a lot, right? Not because they bred this from some kind of more feudally based reality that would start happening, as we will see in the Turkic world from the 7th century with the Oguz, etc., developing more shock force, etc. These were essentially just mostly decorations that would be brought, like it was by many ways normal, but at this point increased in the steps as just your actual wealth together with you showing up. For example, helmets of iron strips crowned with a finial bearing a plume, or a figurine of a fabulous beast with a leather mailed camel, right? The camel starts appearing at this time, starts being generalized at this point, again, at the Turkic turn of steppes warfare, likely because of increased, especially arrow fire. As we've seen, the Iranians mostly develop in their last phase more solid armor for mostly, against shocks, right? Also against arrows, but camel, this other kind of, less rigid kind of type of armor, especially in covering the face, the neck, etc., starts becoming likely connected with a relative increase in, as we've seen, missile power, right? The fabulous beasts, too, are often more chthonic in nature than the ones we see in Sarmatian times, for example. There had already been such a thing, but this thing increases. Apparently, again, the idea of a more savage wolf hunt, right? Some sort of, more Dionysianly, initiatory starts to appear here as a sort of the moment, again, of before transfiguration, one in which you have to evoke the darkest forces to eventually tame. And the Huns identified mostly with this, again, in my opinion, providing with the evidence that they were just aware of this kind of destruction from which to regenerate and starting over, right? The Hunnic throat was protected by a high armored gorget. Naturally, all these items, as we were saying, are part of the elite Hunnic horsemen, right? So what really distinguishes them in warfare, because otherwise the majority of horsemen were unarmored, even though, and this is interesting, especially in the West, mail started spread substantially. It was worn underneath a more solid, long lamellar armor, usually, that had already been around, as we've seen, composed of strapped together plates, and with a scaled pelerine, shoulder pieces and brassards, both made of steel strips. Again, a bit more composite type of armor, like more, patchier in a way. Probably because the full lamellar one was available, as we've seen, but was probably less, again, available in general. Greaves of steel strips were secured to overlap mail shows. So there is this all hints at from one side there is, at least for the elite, a shock concern, naturally, that has to do also with the fact they're fighting against the Romans and the Chinese, right? We've seen this also for the Mongols, that generally speaking their armor increased dramatically, but also with the Sakas, because when they began to fight mostly against the sedentary civilizations, where the clash intensified. And the equipment of the Huns and their horses was richly adorned with gold, silver plaques with inlaid red stones or glass, so a bit, as we've seen, bringing together with them this magnificent result of loot, let's say. As we'll see now, however, such heaviness for what we can document in the West seems to have been connected, compared especially to Central Asian standards, or even the Eastern Asian ones, with the great influence that the Romans and even the Germans, by a degree, had on the Black Huns, right? Because the whites differ somehow, and as we have seen, the blacks were fundamentally just melting away eventually in this world, mostly of Romano-Germanic outline, right? The Huns, as we've seen, were mixed with other peoples. For example, along the way, they had collected some Ugric tribes that traditionally weren't even, living in the forests, not much in the steppes per se, but who were open to this kind of longitudinal traffic that would bring them half a millennium later to settle in the Hungarian plain. In fact, at least some of their descendants. These Sarmatians, too, had been incorporated by the Huns. The Huns had a great reputation of the Sarmatians, of some peoples, especially the Goths, right, among the Germans, and there is no doubt these had already, as we've seen in their Bosphorian kingdom, essentially become a mix. In this case, exactly, right, because at least a mix between Iranians and Germans, because at least the Goths arrived and they literally started to rule over mostly places that had been Iranian for millennia, right? So about the Goths, you can seriously claim that even though there is, in spite of all the ethnographic, making up of their origins from Scandinavia, actually there is a continuity. There was a genetic sort of, at least the initial core was, yes, likely. We were not sure of that, but coming from Northern Europe and still, absorbing in that sense and kind of mixing with these other peoples along the way. Not just the Sarmatians, by the way. Surely Proto-Slavs, right? Etc. There are some people, especially the Eastern Germans, are definitely more mixed than the other Germans. There is no doubt. Than the Western ones, than the Northern ones, than the Elbe ones, right? This distinction must be made, and so they had developed as a consequence a Sarmatian influence, hell of a cavalry, right? We don't see at that point, because exactly those steps had failed. They had declined themselves under the pressure of the gods. That degree of, for example, of cataphract warfare. We don't really see Gothic cataphracts. I mean, we can be sure that there may have been, but at least not in dramatic quantities. And generally speaking, again, these were relatively poor areas, right? They didn't have, the Germans mostly, even the most nomadically influenced, let's say, maintained that phase of sedentary people, right? The majority of their forces are on foot. They are sold just by tribal cohesion. So yes, they are spiced and exotic and influenced how much you like by the steppes, but they still are visibly, say, at least sedentary, right? Likely Germanic in whatever that means at this point, but in that sense, kind of Central Northern European in standards. So we're pretty much the standards of all sedentary Europe at that point, right? Arguably, the only difference being that surely the Scandinavians had very different warfare much more primitive and underdeveloped one than the continental Germans, first of all, and especially these eastern ones. As you know, Waldenism, the militaristic war cult, etc., of the Germans, that is part of the, again, still of the Indo-European mythology. It's the same thing, basically. The Romans, the Veda, etc., is born on the continent. It was brought, in fact, from the steppes, as a matter of fact. It was the equivalent of it. And Scandinavia was even a much less militarized place, right, than Central Europe. That was instead much more punching, compact, shocking, brutal, and really effective. Even if you look at the Alemanni, for example, they had the strongest infantries around after the Roman ones in Europe. An infantry charge of these Germanic people was really a thing. It was arguably all they had, right? That's why the Goths basically stand out, because they developed this kind of substantial cavalry. But again, the essentials of these kind of Central European standard is there. We're not talking about Germanic versions of the Sarmatians. We're rather seeing something like more a Sarmatian version of the Germans. Let's put it in this way. I don't know if it makes sense, but I think it renders the idea. And the Huns were correctly, from a historical point of view, and literally in the sense, wiping off the face of the earth of those who stood in their way, right? And that's why they became known to the entire world as such, right? They were the scourge of God because, as we've seen, the steppes had undergone a major crisis, and these peoples were passing, and whatever they couldn't bring with them, they would simply massacre, right? Increasing their deterrent power, spreading terror across the steppes, wanting to style themselves as the destroyers, right? It's a bit, again, the Germanic war bands were very often adopted, even in Roman service, this kind of mentality that they were the... Look at the Notitia Dignitatum. There are symbols of snakes, of wolves. There's not like an eagle, right? Because they felt themselves, they were those kind of followers, wolf packs, right? After all, they were in the service of Rome, and Rome herself, would have not allowed these peoples to just even simply represent themselves as the Apollonian light while they were literally in her service, so under her. So that's the thing I was talking about before, the sense of being the Ouroboros, being this terrifying primordial snakes that is rotting the foundations of the world. This is what the mythology said. Like, we are the destroyers, we are the forces of hell. Beware, because we are arriving. It's a way it's what we witness in the same moment of crisis of civilization. People want to self-sabotage the system because they cannot, in that sense, still bear the burden of the difference of quality of the existing. The idea that there is a hierarchy that is more successful than theirs, right? And so they become anti-heroes in some way. At the same time, this was at least in part justified by the fact that they thought that this older system was giving way, right? So essentially both sides were wrong, because at least in the sanitary world the hybrid of that would come. But again, in the steppes, people got slaughtered en masse, and the worst for them, in a sense, is that if some people was crushed in Europe, we know that some, for example, Germanic tribes literally called the Romans to watch while they exterminated other Germanic tribes to show how cool they were. And so at least we know, because Roman historiography documented that. But what happened in the steppes? There are peoples that were there, were important, whatever. We do not even know their names, because they were basically simply exterminated, and or included also in other, again, becoming deported, becoming subjects, moving on. And that's why the history of the steppes, especially at this point, is so messed up, because more than the usual, at least, because we do not understand damn what the hell is going on. And that's why we don't know precisely even where the Huns stemmed from. In any case, they weren't a made-up ethnographic invention for masking the fact that these were, the Germans in disguise. No, these people we see even just from the few genetic but meaningfully elite graves in, from Hunnic, dominated territory, where we see what they are. They have Eastern Asian genomes, and that speaks volumes, right? Because that alone tells us how successful they had to be to have arrived up to that point, alive, and even having a freaking aristocratic grave in a place where basically there wasn't anything. In the Hungarian plain, and the thing again is shockingly brutal if you think about that. But that's what these people were. I'm not sure. I try to sometimes sound hyperbolic to impress the audience a bit. Speaking of this magnitudinal scale, of massacres and ruthless violence, but that's literally what happened. And for the most relevant thing, I would say, anthropologically speaking, is that for these peoples it was completely normal to do so. Their entire world revolved around it. And the more they did that, and in a sense, the more successful they were. Obviously, there was some sort of political wisdom for which, again, demographic resources were very precious, so not really everybody would make that end. But as we've seen in the steppes, the decisions are more ruthless, because you more or less just cross the space. In a way, you could say, what the hell cares where I live behind? But the idea of still maintaining these pastures open, the idea of straddling the steppe, a bit like the Pax Mongolica later on. We know they wiped the hell out of entire peoples. Other civilizations did similar things to maintain local balance, right? So there's nothing strange about that. But there was an iron logic about it. So as we were saying before, the appearance of the Hun warrior, say of the 3rd, 4th century, west of the Urals, so we're talking mostly about the Black Huns, slightly changed in comparison to the east. As we were saying before, male became, say, more spread, right? The helmet more rounded, like a bit like the Spangen helmet we'll see now that they drew, as seen from the Romans, from the Germans. So occasionally made in 2 parts. We can speak up to the Urals surely of a Roman influence. As we often say, the Romans basically ignored the geographical existence of today's territory of Russia, right? Except their artifacts are to be found up to the Urals. So it means that the peoples living there knew perfectly, where this thing came from. The Romans didn't give a damn, because of course there was nothing there worth of her interest. But in this sense, we shouldn't underestimate how much the Huns were, in fact, aware themselves in these movements about Rome, about this huge empire. So for them, it was, as we've seen, a big deal even before they arrived at its outskirts and beginning to loot it, to abuse it, and all these kinds of things. So the Huns also absorbed a lot of Sarmatian elements in the area. It was definitely more Iranian in nature than East. They received this Roman influence. They are fundamentally, it's leaving aside the fact that they fought in some war bands for Rome, and Hunnic auxiliaries are to be found throughout all the this period further beyond in the 6th and the 7th century, there were the Huns normally around in the Byzantine area. We'll talk about this. But they literally also fought against Rome. So as we've seen, and especially at that point in history, Rome had even increased her defensive and offensive capacity. Made videos about the late Roman army. And the Constantinian one was definitely... this was just before the Huns arrived, because basically up to, to Valens, the question is, the system worked, right? But they had dramatically increased their, for example, their range, their missile power, and they also were much better, designed to withstand harder shocks from these, again, Alemannic infantry charges and the Sasanian cavalry ones. They were also much better equipped to cope with peoples from the steppes. They had been copying cataphracts, they had plenty of horse archers, and generally speaking, all these movements on the eastern frontier had brought lots of these peoples, as we've seen, to simply join the Roman army. So definitely the Huns were, even in the 5th century, coping with a tough nut. As long as the Roman state existed, the Roman army existed, and it was the top one available around, right? So the Huns were not superior to the Roman army. They had some political, strategical or tactical upper hand on the base of the circumstances, mostly Roman weakness for internal reasons. And as we were saying before, they didn't have the cultural capacity to rule over such a developed empire, even for late antique standards, like Rome, right? Nor retrospectively, even in the rest of the sedentary outskirts, right? In Germany, or I don't know, in the Illyricum and these places. As a consequence, their political success was, and so all what followed from a military point of view, just would occur on the base of how much success they could keep scoring over the empire, right? Or how many successful raids, plundering, etc. they could carry out against the empire. And as you know, Attila was definitely not much of a tender-souled human being, let's put it in this way, nor his men were, and many areas of the empire were savagely plundered. And the Huns established their own fortified ring in an unknown location, essentially in what would become the Hungarian plain, close to the boundaries of the empire, creating a domination that stretched from the Black Sea to Scandinavia. Right, we do not know the extent of, the political, subjection that some peoples were informally to accept, right? But there is no doubt that at this point, also lots of peoples from these areas joined the Huns, because, as we were saying before, it was normal for these nomadic peoples just to even without obliging these other foreigners, but to have them flocking in their command, right? When a big raid was to be carried out, this would remain in the steppes like normal. Just look during the Crusades, if a Seljuk army moved from Aleppo or Mosul, there were people as far as Central Asia just saying, okay, we want to arrive to plunder and to loot and to pave the way of this army. So that's how they function. Except here there were more sedentary populations, mostly the Germans, doing that. Just like there were Germans from the Roman side that were opposing the same people. And there were essentially war bands. This was typical of the tribal war there, of the comitatus, that were fighting from both sides. Right? We mostly say the Visigoths and the Franks were with Aetius, and the Ostrogoths, the all this the Gepids, the Longobards were the Huns, but I don't know. It was full of Frankish war bands in Attila's army. Think about the Burgundians who were trying to survive in between, in the middle of the Rhine, just not deciding which side to go, and eventually were deported by the same Aetius, albeit in the Nibelungenlied. They said it was at Attila's court in Vienna that the massacre of the Burgundians really happened. In any case, a pretty bloody hell, if you know the story. And well, it's not different from what really happened to them, and what could happen normally at the time. So the Huns had arrived in Europe. I skipped this passage, but it's important, of course, in say in the last quarter of the 4th century, in the lower steppes of the lower Dnieper, you have essentially the first big wave, right, that routed the troops of the state of the Goths, that as we've seen had been dwelling along the Dnieper and the Dniester River for more than 150 years. They had become just recently Christian, albeit Arian, in their confession, and this caused, of course, the same gods to be absorbed by the Huns and pouring together with them upon the Roman Empire. There were other gods that, as you know, were essentially entering the Roman Empire, being de facto deported, but rebelling in the meanwhile and crushing the Roman army, killing even the Roman emperor at Adrianople. Not much of a blow to the empire, actually, because after 10 years, the Romans fielded basically the same army fighting against another Roman army of the same size. Just that was important because, as you know, the Visigoths still managed to survive in spite of the defeats at the hands of Stilicho, etc., and to settle as federati, as within the boundaries of the empire for the first time, which was a huge deal as a single people. So up to that point, again, there weren't the the division between the Terbingi and the Greutungi, right? The latter were in theory what we call the Ostrogoths later, or at least part of their ancestors. And they were, having conquered this Bosporan kingdom, really moving towards the east, the place of the rising sun, even in this recently Christian mindset towards, Jerusalem and Jesus and the solar culture that they had themselves, thinking of being blessed divinely, right? So the gods get brutally traumatized by the Huns that come and destroy this magnificent thing that no other German had ever achieved, and they undergo this severe, even further toughening and autocratization, because this is what we see among the peoples that remain under the Huns in Europe, that the others, again, in fact, are from the Roman side, because again, everything east of the Rhine or north of the Danube was Hunnic, right? So if you were a German, you were either under the Hun or from the other side, from the Roman side. And we see that the peoples from the Hunnic side not just were more, equestrianly biased, but that tendentially they acquired, compared to the prior time, a much more brutally autocratic mentality. Right, at least in part, this helps them because they become, arguably, they do not become more compact because, as we just said, most of them get really shattered. But in a sense, their elites prevail, a bit like in the Hunnic world. We see it. There are lots of linguistic indicators about the fact that, especially the Germanic elite, began to adopt this wok, like, I don't know, Kalmuk, like this Turkic root in their names. There is the German root and then the Hunnic suffix, because they were being co-opted by the Huns. This tells you, of course, how important they were for Attila himself for example. At the same time, it speaks also of a change of these elites. Doing tender things such as drinking from your rival's skull, right, or deforming your own skull, by the way, and similar things. Relatively superficial. Again, these peoples maintain a Germanic outlook, basically in everything. We were not really, doubtful about who was who, ethnically speaking, as far as they were at least characterized from politically. But it's an important mark that is felt. Let's talk a bit about the Gothic arms and armor. So in the 4th and 5th century AD, the armament of the Goths, and basically, as we've seen at the root, the one of other Germanic tribes in Central Europe, comprised a long dagger, the sax, that basically gets longer over time. There are certain, this happened, also in later, during the later Middle Ages, but some, Longobards saxes are basically 70 centimeters long sabers, right? Very, very good for mounted combat, as a matter of fact. And they are single-edged, so you could see there some sort of influence from the steppe, definitely. Consider that basically the Germans developed even their own, whatever you see in terms of heavy armor, it had been essentially either Roman or Celtic, right? Even the spada, the coat of mail, they had taken everything from these peoples. But you see sometimes this kind of wilder stuff like the sax, which is very useful in many ways, like for skinning animals, cutting wood, all this stuff, but let's say also for disemboweling people on the occasion, and also sticking this stuff into, at a close range, into somebody's body, even with armor on if you find the uncovered parts between the joints, etc. Then they have the long sword, derived from the late Roman cavalry one, the spada, right? Double-edged, pretty compact, bare center shifted towards the top. It's really good for cavalry, for mounted combat, and as we've seen, this stuff stemmed from, yes, we say the Celtic world, but actually, already at this point, a lot of Iranian influence from those massive swords from the Sarmatian mount had come around and was being revived, because there are lots of Sarmatians around fighting for the Romans, fighting for mixing with the Germans, and so on. And this thing does cut, right? It's much less of a thrusting weapon. There were battle axes, also in use, a bit like the Danish axe in Viking times. Actually, this stuff, you see bigger, say, more punching weapons, especially anti-armor ones, they all come from the actual civilized side. The Francisca was not an ethnic Germanic weapon, it was seemingly mutilated by the Germans from the Roman army. Equally, the Danish axe was not really Danish, it was actually coming from Carolingian warriors. Naturally, they spread because these peoples began, especially the elites, to get armored as well, and so they simply pick the best from the available technology and they adapt it to their own tradition. Since the Germanic world is a bit more still heroic and tribal and primitive, so the idea of single combat and the fact that you also may have this need of fighting more often on foot, because they're not traditionally much of cavalrymen more than other peoples. A bit like the later Danish axe. Again, why is it so much of a thing that we associated with the Vikings? Because the Vikings had a bit less cavalry than, essentially, a deal less cavalry than the Carolingians. Don't get me wrong, they did have it. I'm one of the greatest, supporters of Norse cavalry during the Viking era, because it gets very overlooked. But generally speaking, they mostly fight on foot, and on horseback you can't handle double-handed swords or axes. So the most obvious use is, trying to open somebody's, torso open with a single blow, even with mail in between. And you need naturally massive physique, but given that these Germans come from, pretty and radically savage places, and they're mostly also physically select for that reason, they surely didn't lack, say, beefiness and muscularity, right? It was a bit of a trope in Roman ethnography, but you gotta admit that at least, the Germans were essentially the tallest, more robust peoples in Europe. At the time, Germanic peoples, like in the north, still today. The Germanic bow was essentially the typical European one that existed and remained always the same identical one throughout all history since prehistory ever, right? The single strip of wood made one. There were long bows, normal bows, but they're the same identical bow ever, used everywhere in Europe and the sanitary world since ever. There's no difference whatsoever anywhere. So not yet the composite one. Naturally, some Germans would have adopted composite bows from, especially, among the Goths from this Eastern world, but not quite. They didn't have much that bias. Like if you look at the Romano-Germanic, of course, recruitment laws, there must have been lots of archers because the poorest people were expected just to serve with bow and quiver, because they didn't have anything else basically. But that means they sucked, militarily speaking. So of course the warrior was something else, and arrows were just like a bit of a support thing. Arguably, again, in a moment in history like this, where material culture is getting poorer, there's great crisis, there are also few armor, so arrows are nasty stuff. In the Germanic religion mythology, you always find the hero that for a single misdeed gets taken out in unglorious ways, and mostly in fact hit by a missile, something from the back, right? To witness the fact that in the Germanic world they had pretty impressed in mind that, a person could be taken out that easily, especially because there wasn't much armor around, but not all. You find it even in the Iliad, for that matter. But again, it's what we were saying before, that a people like the Huns was considered like, yes, they might have been powerful. The German tradition, as we've seen, is deeply impressed with the Huns. They make the Nibelungenlied about them. But who uses the bow is a coward, right? As we've seen, the people who use the bow normally are the poorest, the lesser ones. Arguably, everyone knew how to use one, right? Except you would use it mostly during the hunt, if you were a true man. But the chivalric ideal here is that you face an enemy with your sword in a one-to-one engagement, and without any diversions, right? But the reality of warfare is hardly the one of the heroic ideals. But the difference sticks, right? And the sanitaries are not essentially do not have armies of archers. The steppes guys have, and especially the Huns did this, nomads evidently. The arrows were kept by the Goths in a cylindrical wooden quiver, straight to the back. The Gothic noblemen who fought mounted had, besides swords, a rich defensive panoply, in which the Roman traditions and the Germanic achievements had been synthesized. Right? Consider that the metallurgic centers of Europe were shifting from Noricum, from which the Romans mostly drew their own de facto steel, or properly carbonized iron, from the Rhineland. Right, so the Germans were getting the monopoly of that, especially the Franks, on the longer run. And they did derive from this steppes influence. Again, also as we were saying before, the Celtic sense of, of armor, that most of this in the very origin was something not really from there. It was mostly from the east, as we've seen, both for Mail, for even for the Sparta as such. Of course, as very warlike peoples, they would develop perfection that kind of armament, but the steppes, albeit more episodically, would peak that kind of warlikeness. Right? So even if they were poorer, they would also implement the designs for these cemeteries to also get a bit of that too, right? Not just providing the hardware, just seeing what these barbarians would do with that to just eventually getting it back. So the most what is interesting, I'd say, about arrow fire is that, of course, if you look, especially in later times with the Slavs against the nomadic peoples, that there are some solutions, also in terms of shields, etc., that tend to be very anti-nomadic horse archer, and that must create a lot of counter-missile fire. So, especially among the Goths, I wouldn't be surprised to see the greatest amount of missile fire among the Germanic peoples, right? And even larger shields, armor, as we'll see now. The Gothic elite wore a mail coat, sometimes even with long sleeves and a mail coif, which suggests that, again, projectiles flew like hell around there. And they had to take over the Sarmatians, wearing another Sarmatian archery in the process. So it's very heavy equipment, telling the truth, and this comes together with even beefier horses and tougher mounts. That's why the Huns like the Goths, because they are among the centuries. They have something there that is wild but still advanced enough to be profitably integrated even in the Hunnic army. The Gothic helmet was egg-shaped, was composed, as we've seen, of 4 two-parts tied by a wide framework. The Spangenhelm richly adorned and gilded. This was compact, solid, but it was designed to receive substantial blows, where other types of helmets, like the lamellar ones and etc. In any case, they were mostly for the elite, right? These helmets had also cheek pieces, and often also camail that we've seen before, or even among the Huns. So again, the idea that you want to protect your neck from arrows is a legitimate concern. Just like the Huns, they crowned their helmets by a hair of feather plume, which may have had, again, something with the Steppe's influence. In fact, it would remain around even in Central Europe up to the Middle Ages because of this Steppe's bias, even among the Germans and the Slavs, famously enough. We will talk about that. There are very beautiful 13th century examples of that. Consider that that's the same century in which the Draco standard disappears from Germany. Right? So it's as if the migration era had lasted there up to that point, and we often in fact don't understand how much Central Europe was impacted by the steppe peoples. Now the Goths, as we've seen, had large round shields made of planks that were substantial defense against especially arrow fire. They were normally flat, so these were mostly used by infantry. If cavalry was substantially well armored, they may have had not necessarily smaller shields, but at least even more concave ones. But the idea, of the shield wall, where you can interlock the various shields, is something for an infantry line that doesn't have much of a individualistic, heroic kind of mentality. They mostly have to stick together and forming this wooden barrier against, say, the barrage of, say, Hunnic arrows, which is very important. These shields were occasionally covered with leather, and they were painted, right, to show in a proto-heraldic way which clan they belonged, which kind of meanings they would represent on them, calling God right on as a witness to their values, to their own way of emerging, whichever animal they picked, saying that we're transitioning from that to divine mankind in the process as men, as warriors, in the war bands, etc. The edges of the shield were reinforced by iron clips, which had a lot to do with, again, bearing from these massive slashes of the spatai, and even, as we've seen, even this pretty brutally conceived single-edged cutting swords that the Huns were bringing with them, because otherwise the wood alone is not dramatically effective. At the center of the shield there was a rounded iron umbo that would hopefully deflect the arrow heads penetrating the planks, at least in that point, like just the hand was behind it, the umbo. And shields were often also adorned with laid-on metal figurines of birds, beasts, as we were saying, mounted, and foot warriors, as well as with crosses. Right, so this thing starts appearing even in their own spiritual conscience, the awareness of the imperial ideal for themselves, the necessity of self-sacrifice that was being now told in a more Christian sauce, that fundamentally got down to the same convictions of the what we call improperly as the pagan world. They were all essentially coping with, again, the necessity of civilization. So the Huns that's why the Huns would be out of this, because they hardly even conceived that, and as you know, they would dissolve themselves shortly after. They would be roaming around. The Roman army was full of Huns at some point. There were lots even of Magistra Militum of Hunnic origin. Again, there was a bit like together with this among the Germans too. There were lots of chiefs that had they were half Huns. They had different mixed origins. Sometimes we can't even reconstruct accurately, but it was a bit at that point, having been part of that world beyond, right? It was a bit this mentality parties, one about the Romano-Germanic background, one the Unno-Germanic background. And there was a lot of contact, unavoidably, because they were largely the same continent, the same, say, places that could be very much, visited in a short time, but they essentially lived in very different ways. Like Central Europe was a very different place than, say, Southern Europe, Western Europe, etc. And they still maintain a bit that greater sense of wilderness, of more, say, brutal background and mentality, and lack of political cohesion and stability for a substantial while. And these were the areas, in fact, that were ravaged at some point later, even by the Avars, right? It was like the limit of really the civilized world that would go on, in spite of all these hits, as we've seen, contracted, shrank, in crisis in many ways, but still consolidating, right? While the Huns basically disappeared as a people. So this is more or less the picture that I wanted to describe. We'll keep talking about Gothic, Hunnic warfare, and more. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.